Let me paint you a picture. The year is 1996. Resident Evil has just released to widespread critical acclaim and high sales, coining a new genre in the process: survival horror. 2 years later, Resident Evil 2 releases and it sells even better and is hailed as one of the best games ever made, setting the trend into full overdrive and solidifying survival horror as a hot genre. Companies take note, and immediately a lot of games in that style get cranked out, some good and genre-defining in their own way, like Konami's Silent Hill. Many bad and responsible for turning people against the concept of tank controls and fixed camera angles. But I love these messy creations and the many weird experiments that resulted from the early days of 3D gaming, so I would like to share with you one choice cut today. In that environment of sheer resi-mania, one Koei took a look at Resident Evil 2 and decided, yeah, we can do that. And so released the subject of today's video, Nanatsu no Hikan Senritsu no Bisho, for the Dreamcast in the year 2000, the Dreamcast's very own Resident Evil 2 at home. Please ignore the fact that Resident Evil 2 was actually ported to the Dreamcast literally a month before this game came out, because I'm sure Koei would have liked it if people did. As an aside, can I mention how much I love how goofy and cheap the Japanese Dreamcast box for Resident Evil 2 looks? Why does Leon look like he's strutting on the runway? Why does this look like a bootleg? It's not a bootleg, I literally own a copy, but it looks so fake. This is the fakest looking copy of a real and good video game I've ever seen in my life. Anyway, Nanatsu no Hikan. So this is a Japan-only release. It never made it to the English-speaking world, but fortunately I'm able to demonstrate this game in English without having to do any work of translating myself, thanks to the creation of an English patch by the 8 Mansions translation team, with the core translator being friend of the channel and fellow Kusoge enthusiast Snowy Aria. So big thanks to her. It's a good translation, I'm more than happy to vouch for its quality and use it in this video. She translated the title as 7 Mansions Ghastly Smile, so that's what I'll be using here too. As a brief history aside, this game is actually a sequel to a game simply called Nanatsu no Hikan, or just 7 Mansions, no subtitle. Released the same year as the original Resident Evil, also on the PS1, but also the Sega Saturn and PC. It is not a survival horror game, and is actually one of those first-person point-and-click style adventure games that doesn't really have much of a horror vibe at all. It's more of a silly mystery game, which makes the decision to make the sequel a Resident Evil clone all the more telling as a bandwagon hop, but I digress. You do not need to know anything about this game, as its sequel outside of the title seems to have no meaningful relation to it, which is good because it's untranslated and so inaccessible to most of my audience. I did not finish 7 Mansions PS1. Now, putting aside the fact that part of this is that I'm not a native speaker of Japanese and I found the game to be quite a challenging read, it's also just not a type of game I'm very fond of. I find these sorts of console point-and-click adventure type games very cumbersome to use. This is the kind of game where you have to pick an object from a list of objects and then pick a verb from a list of verbs one by one every time, and almost immediately the game starts with a puzzle that involves like 15 different objects, and they all pile up in your inventory at the same time and you have to leaf through them 5 at a time, and it's a mess. It wasn't very fun to pilot. It does get progressively weirder as it goes along, but this is just not my kind of thing. It seems to have gotten a fairly decent reception among Japanese players though, with particular praise for its storytelling, penned by award-winning author and TV entertainer Kageki Shimoda, whose name I wanted to mention because this is a real photo of the guy. Every single photo you can find of this man online has a different but equally incredible fit. The dude is absolutely living his best life. He maxed out his bravery stat and made it everyone else's problem. I felt the need to bring up the previous game because English language sources tend to treat this game and this game like they are the same game. Wikipedia uses the wrong box art for its article on the sequel, for instance, but no, different games. This one's a sequel and was not in fact penned by an award-winning author, something that will become very apparent shortly, and this is the one we're looking at, okay? Okay. So getting started, first booting up the game you are treated to an intro consisting of creepy faces followed by a careening tone shift into a shot of a beach as soothing music plays, which gives way to this shot of the game's female lead lying on a bed before becoming a Sony Vegas wave effect and a scream rings out. Spooky. Also conveys absolutely nothing and feels kind of random. This is actually a pretty good encapsulation of things to come. Actually, starting a game, we are given a choice of our 2 protagonists, Kei Asuka and his weirdly hypnotizing blue camo getup, and Reina Shirakawa. The game claims that Kei is an action-focused character, and Reina is a thinking-type game, but as we shall see, this is kind of a half-truth. Regardless, for now, we'll go ahead and pick Kei. Immediately we are greeted with a kind of terrifying close-up of Reina waking up from a nightmare, presumably the game's intro. So nothing you saw in that intro actually mattered, and it was just Reina having a fever dream. The setup is that our 2 leads are currently en route via boat to remote New Russell Island in pursuit of Professor Ernest McFerson, who left the pair a foreboding letter shortly before going missing. The pair are invested in this because Ernest is Reina's uncle and Kei's teacher at university, and Reina and Kei are childhood friends. This is all context I don't think you get outside of the instruction manual, because this game released at the time when you were still expected to read those before playing, so I am dutifully going along with that. They arrive on the island, where Kei manages to somehow immediately sprain his ankle while walking on nothing. Our hero, folks. Reina runs off to try and get help, and a mysterious man pops out of the jungle and offers to heal Kei's ankle with a laser beam? After doing so, he then tells Kei to drink the island's special meta water before vanishing. Presumably it steals all of your personal information. Just a lot of strange technology being thrown at the player to throw off their sense of the setting before you've even had a chance to press a button. Newly healed, Kei also walks off and we begin the game proper. This is a fairly inauspicious intro that belies the fact that one of the highlights of this game is absolutely its crazy-ass cutscenes, and we will get to the madness in due time, but like all good stories, Ghastly Smile starts humble and unassuming, insofar as a magic healing beam counts as humble anyway. Kei arrives at the reception of a genetic research facility, and we get control for the first time. The game controls in a fairly orthodox survival horror tank control kind of way. You need to turn from side to side before running forward. But you can actually run in a less restrictive way, but only if you hold down the aim button. But it isn't truly freeform, it's more like 8-way strafing rather than standard third-person movement. Combining these two movement styles grants you a more fluid range of movement than tank controls would initially suggest, but it's got a bit of a strange learning curve. You can tell this game came out around when tank controls were losing ground in favour of now more traditional and standardized third-person action game controls, because Ghastly Smile handles like a strange hybrid. A game that represents that exact evolutionary link between the classic and modern styles. Awkward, definitely, but kinda charming. They were getting there. Shortly after arriving, Kei is attacked by the game's most standard enemy type. Check this guy out. If you thought my comparisons to Resident Evil meant you'd be fighting zombies, then oh, no. Ghastly Smile has much funnier ideas about enemy design. This goofy-looking dude with chain-link arms strapped to blades is the main enemy type in this game, so get used to him. It kinda reminds me of the enemies from the early game of Devil May Cry 2, and boy isn't that good company. Currently we have no weapons and so must flee, where we see Reina being similarly pursued, so that's our goal for now, rescue Reina. In the room we just fled into, we get our first weapon, a trusty knife, a genre classic, and now we can actually participate in the game's combat, but all the enemies promptly vanish for a little bit, so that'll have to wait, but oh boy, Ghastly Smile's combat, look forward to it. We are left to poke around the facility a bit, collecting keys to open doors and so on, and I play around with one of the game's supposed selling points. The fact that you can, at any time, change the camera between a third person behind the shoulder view to Resident Evil-style fixed camera angles, and even first person, which I never recommend because it's extremely nauseating. Similarly, the fixed camera angles are a cute inclusion, but they never have the artful purpose of Resident Evil's framed environment, so you'll likely spend most of the game sticking to the usual over-the-shoulder cameras. There's hardly much need to change to suit the situation. You never need to examine the environments in more detail in first person or some other such use case. It kinda comes off like a weird flex sometimes, but one that isn't even especially timely, since 1994's Dr. Hauser, often cited as one of the very first fully 3D rendered survival horror games, even though I'm not sure how legit that claim is, also boasted this feature. Incidentally, that game was also only released in Japan, but was fan-translated into English again by the very same Snowy Aria that translated this one. Beginning to think they have a type. Adding to the weird flex is that as you explore more rooms, you notice that the game has a tendency to do slow, panning shots for every new room you enter, and I'm not really sure what this is in aid of. This game doesn't look terrible by the standards of its day, don't get me wrong, it looks fine among the Dreamcast library, but also, this game was released in the year 2000. Shenmue had come out a year prior, Ghastly Smile was not turning any heads with its visual fidelity at that stage. Secondly, it also manages to undercut what little atmosphere the game is able to cultivate. You know how Resident Evil's fixed camera angles very purposefully don't always give you a perfectly clear view of a new room in order to build tension and what have you? Simple but effective stuff. Well, how about a game where 80% of the rooms you enter, the game will give you a completely clear slow panning shot of the entire room, thus allowing you to know immediately what's in the room before you've even gained control. Super. We unlock a few doors and reunite with Reina, who is crying in a corner in a library. As they reunite, this exchange takes place.
Hora, candy.
I'll get more into this later, but I want you to bear in mind that Reina is supposed to be 18. Anyway, the two leave the room and are attacked by a monster, so you are forced into your first fight with Reina in tow. 2v1? No problem. Or at least it would be if Reina didn't stand there gawking awkwardly while the monster proceeds to stab Kay in the abdomen, since for some reason the game defaults partner AI to inactive, so you have to manually enable it if you would like your companion to show any preservation instinct whatsoever in combat. While enabling this, I noticed that pausing the game mid-combat kinda janks the game out a lot. It just stops enemy animations midway, allowing Reina to land the hit and win the fight for me. I wonder if pausing is exploitable in any way. From here, we now have the game's main selling point in full swing. Unlike Resident Evil 2, where the two main characters meet at various points but otherwise go through separate campaigns, in Ghastly Smile, the two protagonists both participate in the same events at the same time, and need to be managed by you, with the secondary character controlled by the AI. So if you picked Kay, Reina is AI, and vice versa. You can't swap characters at will, a la Resident Evil 0 or something. This is a bit of an unfortunate setup because Reina is kind of cursed by the system mechanics to have 33% less health than Kay for no reason, so she's pretty fragile, and as you can imagine, the AI doesn't do a stellar job of keeping her safe. Naturally, if either character dies, it's game over. Furthermore, friendly fire is absolutely a thing in this game, so you've got to be careful of accidentally shooting or stabbing Reina, or as we will see later, the much more likely outcome of her shooting you. Speaking of stabbing, we've got fights sprinkled about now, so let's get into this game's delightful combat, or at least the melee portion, since we don't have guns for now. Kay's knife and Reina's taser are your only ammo-free combat option in the entire game, and one you'll probably spend most of it using, and while the damage is fine, check out this animation. Every time you want to swing your knife to attack, it takes almost 2 full seconds from when you press the button. You might thusly think that combat would be very difficult, because every time you go to attack, there is a huge window where you can be hit first, but surprisingly no. You will get hit during your swing animation, sure, but Ghastly Smile has no concept of the player getting hit out of their attacks. You'll take the damage, but then your attack will complete, and then you'll do your pain-reeling animation after your attack, which looks extremely strange but makes me giggle a bit every time. It's like Kay just got a cramp from swinging his knife around. Ooh, tummy hurt! What this means, though, is that melee combat often devolves into trading hits since your attacks are super slow but largely uninterruptible. Fortunately, you do decent damage, and if you do actually manage to land the first blow without getting hit yourself, you can lock pretty much any enemy in the entire game into an infinite stun loop as long as you time another swing for when their incredibly long pain-reeling animation ends. If you do it too soon, you'll just whiff right through them. Same applies to the player, though. You can't get repeatedly hit either, so at least it's a fair system. It does feel super weird, though. This is the only action game I've ever played that feels like it has turn-based damage. We fight our way through to a room with a bunch of human brains in jars, and an AI computer who calls itself Morris, which is presumably running off one of the jars. Morris is helping us find our missing professor, who as it turns out has been kidnapped by one Dr. Schneider, who we meet in the next room over, and this is where Ghastly Smile's crazy-ass plot really kicks off in earnest. I love that this initial cutscene is framed from the perspective of Schneider's desk because he doesn't actually have an in-game model. We get a better look in the CG cutscene where Schneider reveals...
私はサブリミターである。わかるまいが、人間なんぞ及びもつかない偉大なる超人類だ。サブリミター？自然を破壊し、愚行の限りを尽くす人類を抹殺する。手遅れにならないうちに、我々サブリミターのための豊かな未来を作り出すのだ。
そんなバカな。狂ってる。
遺伝子工学の研究成果を見よう。
And now we have to fight a boss. Kinda. Despite being a boss, this guy is in no way more resistant to getting stun-locked to death due to their super long pain-reeling animation. Better luck next time, champ. I do like its idle animation, though. It reminds me of something. You know how these kinds of games tend to wait until the last couple hours to introduce their villains' big plans of creating better humans to rule or destroy the world and that kind of thing? Ghastly Smile just starts there. We are genuinely like maybe 40 minutes into the game at this point. That might not sound like a lot given how much I've already rambled, but it's a pretty short game. We defeat the boss and leave the facility to continue our search for Ernest at his house, it apparently having not occurred to our two genius leads to start here. Here we meet Tanya and Christy, the latter of which Kay instantly falls for. It is established that Christy is very physically frail and Tanya looks after her, and also that Ernest isn't home either. Should also be noticed that the McFerson residence is the only building in this game that could reasonably be classified as a mansion. If you very generously interpret every major location in this game as a mansion, I guess it adds up to 7? Sure, let's go with that. Our two leads meet with the weird man from earlier again on the way out, and finally get his name, Alan, who it also turns out is Christie's brother. He hands Rainer a laser gun. This is not a joke, this setting has laser guns, and he just automatically hands one to Rainer at this juncture, as the two agree to split up to search for Ernest. This is where the campaign forks depending on your chosen character, with Kay going to the environment lab while Rainer heads to the energy control center, and this is where I'm going to jump back a bit and talk about Rainer's campaign real quick. For the most part, the character you select doesn't change the game massively. Rainer does get a handful of unique cutscenes, and in concordance with the claims that Kay is the action-type game and Rainer is the puzzle game, in situations where Kay could just progress by finding a key, Rainer usually has to solve a puzzle instead. Like in the first area, for instance, Kay just finds the code for this keypad written on a note. Rainer has to solve a whole puzzle involving a letter cipher in order to get the solution. But I wouldn't say Rainer has less combat to compensate for this, she has to fight roughly the same number of enemies as Kay. Albeit she has an easier time dealing with that combat since that aforementioned laser gun is actually the strongest weapon in the game, and it's very handy to be able to just shoot it yourself rather than relying on the AI to help you in combat, which it will not. Speaking of Rainer, I alluded to this earlier and I almost hesitate to make a thing out of this, but Rainer just kind of sucks as a character. She is portrayed as weak both physically and mentally. She cannot wield larger guns because they are too heavy for her baby hands, and in cutscenes she is the first to begin screaming and crying hysterically at anything weird, needing to be given candy from Kay in order to calm her down. The game assuming I would find this charming or endearing, but it's just not, it just kinda sucks. I'm not out here trying to cancel a 2000s Dreamcast game or anything for bad female character Mino-like, but nevertheless, it did genuinely bother me when playing that Rainer is infantilized to point of absurdity. She's no Claire Redfield, put it that way. Not that any character in this game is a forgotten classic, Kay is very McProtagonist man, but at least his terrible fashion sense is noteworthy. Digressing on that, when the two characters are together, the game plays out pretty much the same regardless of who you chose as your protagonist, but this splitting point is the only character-exclusive content, so in order to see both levels here you need to play the game as both characters. Or do you? Because I've kind of buried the lead on Ghastly Smile's most interesting feature until now. You can select either Kay or Rainer as your starting character, but you can also select both and play the entire campaign in a special dedicated two-player split-screen co-op mode. Which was a genuinely novel idea. I don't think anything like this would exist for another 3 years until Resident Evil Outbreak would release. And even then, that only had online co-op. We'd be waiting another year for Obscure to release for a true co-op survival horror fix. And the co-op campaign here is implemented in an interesting way too. When both characters are close to each other, it'll use the fixed camera angle. But when separated, it uses the first-person angle for both, and you cannot change it to the third-person shoulder camera. Furthermore, enemies that are low to the ground for some reason you can't simply rely on auto-aim to bail you out in co-op, it just doesn't work properly. You need to purposefully aim down with left trigger, but once you've aimed down, there seems to be no way to aim back up, so your character will just be staring at their feet like it's a GoldenEye speedrun until you correct the viewing angle by entering a new room with them. There's quite a few unique set pieces made for the co-op game too. For instance, the starting area immediately separates the two and forces one player to dodge around and avoid a monster with no way to defend themselves, while the other player has to search around for a way to help them. Similarly, the first actual fight you're made to do in the co-op game is still without weapons. One player has to lure an enemy over to some gas vents while the other player activates them to kill the monster. Which sounds simple, but extremely was not. It's incredibly picky about where the monster needs to be for it to count. Now, I didn't have anyone willing to indulge my two-player Dreamcast horror game stupidity, so I made the bold decision to play the co-op campaign with 2 controllers by myself. But since it's the game's most unique point, it was worth the struggle. Knowing the game has a co-op mode too also explains some of the more awkward elements of the single player. Like how in solo mode the two characters do not share an inventory, you have to manually trade items like health kits to the other character before they can be used, which is kinda clunky considering the game doesn't have an inventory limit. But it makes more sense when you consider that the game was probably made around co-op. Especially because, jumping back to the game in progress, when the two characters split up, in the co-op game you can actually control both characters completely separately as they play completely parallel games in parallel levels for a bit. Which is honestly quite impressive for the Dreamcast. It doesn't suffer many performance problems while doing this, and both players can progress and interact with their environments completely independently. Albeit this comes at the cost of the co-op mode being a bit buggier than the solo game. For instance, in solo mode when interacting with the environment, text boxes will pause the game around you. In co-op, it totally does not, so enemies can and will beat you to death while you're trying to read a character's internal monologue. The collective puzzle of this split section here is figuring out how to send an email. That is not a joke. Reina's area is pretty small, so she quickly concludes Ernest isn't there, and Kay decides to try to use a life-form detecting computer at the lab to see if Ernest is there or not, a thing that is just there for some reason. But in order to use it, he needs Reina to send the boot file. So the primary puzzle is Kay goofs around collecting stuff while Reina attempts to figure out the mystery of the command line, which I think is fitting because I cannot think of anything scarier than being made to use a command line interface. If you're playing as Kay solo, this simply takes the form of you literally waiting in front of this computer for AI Reina to respond. You might assume it to be based on some other kind of story flag being activated because you are sensible and think reasonably, but you would be wrong. It literally just waits for about a minute and then you can get the file and continue. Great puzzle! I alluded to this before, but the game's combat has a fatal bug that can be exploited, which I'm almost hesitant to share because it can really trivialize a playthrough, but nevertheless here it is. Pausing the game will instantly interrupt enemy attack animations, but not your own, which allows you to move around inconvenient enemies and always get your attacks through first. I resorted to this a lot when playing co-op because the co-op game is noticeably more difficult than either solo campaign, even when you're not trying to play it by yourself like an idiot. It is kind of wild that something this game-breaking can be achieved by simply pressing the start button, but that's the kind of hot nonsense we like on this channel. Resolving the mystery of the email, Kay uses the life-detecting machine and finds Squat. So the two agree to meet up via one last email, having collectively accomplished basically nothing meaningful. So Kay rings up home base, and Tanya informs the two about a shed that could be a clue, so they head there and using a passcode found in two parts in both Kay and Reina's parts of the game, reveals a hidden lab. Yep, we're already at the hidden lab portion of the proceedings, even though we've already explored a minimum of 3 labs by now, so it doesn't really serve as much of a change of scenery. This island is all labs, more labs than Nintendogs, and nowhere near as cute. Ghastly Smile's weird-looking dogs simply do not suffice. It is at this point where the game engages in some rather obnoxious forced back-and-forthing. First you check the security room in the new lab and see a clip of Ernest, so we at least now know we're headed in the right direction. But then Kay gets a call from the McFerson house where Christy and Tanya are being attacked, so you head back, and they're already gone. A pendant left in their place. So you head back to the lab again, and you can't get in due to a voice log, so you grab a tape recorder and backtrack again and record Schneider's voice from a videotape. It's not complicated, but it does feel like it's just here to kill about half an hour of game time. Abridging that, we can gain access to the Microbiology lab, but both characters need to wear a safety suit at all times as an outbreak of the virus that's creating the game's enemies is rampant in the air here, and taking your suit off will result in the player being infected. Said suit restricts the usage of firearms for some reason. Don't know why, it just doesn't let you equip things besides your basic melee weapon here. Taking damage for any reason will also infect you in this area, and the game plays 2 mean tricks here to try to get this to happen to you. Firstly, in an office room, there's this robot in the middle. The robot is not hostile to you unless provoked, but the AI companion is your biggest enemy here, as it is an enemy that can be targeted, so they will try to kill it and almost immediately get slapped in response, causing an infection. Secondly, upon solving the passcode puzzle in that room, it spawns 2 funny dogs directly next to you who will again immediately jump you and cause an infection. You can either abuse the pause bug for all it's worth here and kill them manually, or use the split second you get before your AI partner gets clapped to move directly to this red panel on the wall and activate a switch that instantly kills both enemies. It's a bit tight. If you manage to surpass both these trials without getting cheap shot, you can simply pass through the area with no problems, but if you get infected, you have to do a more complicated solution to smuggle the infected characters through germ security, as you can't directly leave while infected. And finally, in the co-op game, you are actively forced to do the complex solution because they put a key item needed to progress behind a door you can't go through without removing the safety suit and thus getting infected. Infection doesn't actually have any gameplay implications other than turning your health bar purple, as far as I know. We pass through one lab and now arrive at the Clone Lab. It's labs all the way down, man. Here the game introduces these fleshman enemies who mainly attack by suddenly phasing towards you at 3 FPS, and they do not react to most of your attacks. Best avoided, and not even really worth the time to kill, since at this point the game does something really obnoxious and will actively respawn them even if you do kill them. Shortly after arriving at the Clone Lab, we get a cutscene where Schneider dangles a cure for the infection in front of the pair, and I really appreciate the energy Schneider's VA puts into this. The script of this game is corny as hell and not very good, but the cast really puts their chest into every line, which gives the scenes a very enjoyable energy. That cutscene also does not play if you got through without getting a character infected, so that's neat. Then we arrive at a church, where Tanya is playing the organ. She shoots the two a look, and they immediately fall into some sort of hypnosis? Mind control? This is never explained, it just kinda happens. And the two are separated. Tanya tries to inject Reina with something while ranting about turning her into a sublimiter, but is interrupted by Kay, at which point the room starts to fill with poison gas. What follows is a kinda hilarious time segment where the camera pans to blatantly show you a laser cutter on the table, and gives you, the player, 3 full minutes to pick it up and attempt to use it on the window. Not a lot of faith being put in the player here. For this very brief moment as well, Reina is replaced by Tanya, and if you attack her, she makes the same noises that Reina does, so that's funny. You can even play as her briefly if you're playing Reina's scenario, with the only change being you have to pick up the laser cutter off Reina lying on the table instead. I'm pretty sure it's just a model swap, but it's still pretty interesting. There's an entire extra playable character and relevant UI elements for a set piece that is typically completed in literally 10 seconds. The group escape the room and proceed to immediately disregard Tanya's weird mad scientist moment she just had where she tried to turn Reina into a superhuman or something. Like, they both just immediately drop it. They no longer care, and she just walks off. That's it. That's the last you see of Tanya for the rest of the game. Have I mentioned I love this game's cutscenes? Because I do. They're so stupid. Stupider still, investigating a corner of the room reveals exactly 2 vials of the serum for the infection with the hilarious remark, "Serum! It was hidden behind the machine." Just incredible stuff. I love that there was not even a vague attempt to build up to this or justify it. This just... it's just there. Cool, man. This solves your infection problem if you had it. But the fun doesn't stop here, as almost immediately after this we bump into this guy in a hallway looking injured. This is Ricky, a character Reina meets earlier in an extremely short and bizarre cutscene where he introduces himself by immediately asking Reina, a girl he has just met, if she has any food on her, to which she immediately complies and just hands him a lollipop. And that's Ricky. That's all you see of this character before that point. He's actually a secret agent who was sent to blow up the lab and instead entrusts this onto 2 random teenagers before peacing out. The game does something very funny with this in the co-op game where Reina accidentally activates the timer on the bombs immediately, giving you 15 minutes to complete the rest of the section, which is on the tighter end of things here. Especially since the first thing you need to do is fight a boss, this crazy robot-looking thing called a Guardian. If you're playing as Reina or in co-op, the laser pen you got makes pretty efficient work of this guy, but if you're playing as Kay, you're begging AI Reina to help you out. She won't. She will sit there and point menacingly, but not actually shoot, until she suddenly flips into murder mode and just mows the guy down. Just be careful when she gets like this, because again, she can still shoot you, and she will. We free Ernest, finally, and he informs the pair that Schneider plans to destroy humanity using Christie with something called the Ark. He does not explain what any of that means, and we peace out to make good on Ricky's request to blow up the joint. You have to put a couple of bombs in rooms and then head towards the main control room, where we meet Schneider in person yet again, and he promptly goes Super Saiyan. This starts a boss fight against Satan, where he immediately punches both characters in the head so fast the UI doesn't even have time to load in for high damage. If you're not equipped with ammo that actually causes a stun reaction, this guy will punch you to death in a matter of seconds, so I hope you save the good stuff for this fight. Or, you know, pause bug. Always a good fallback for dealing with this game's combat. Schneider melts into goo, and we plant the main bomb and open the way out. In the co-op game, the timer is running the whole while, and I escape with 5 minutes left on the clock, which seems like a lot, but bear in mind I completed both solo campaigns a couple of times before trying the co-op game, so I imagine this would be much harder if you were trying to figure this out on the fly having never seen it before. In the solo game, you start the timer right here, so you get a whole 6 minutes to walk 2 rooms and exit through the main gate. Okay. Bit of a gap of intensity there. If you screw up any part of this sequence, still having the bombs in your inventory when you leave, not setting the timer before leaving, etc., you get a non-standard game over, which is a bit mean in the co-op game when the whole thing is on a timer from the get-go. And so the final area rises out of a lake in a very JRPG-esque fashion, and we head over to the Ark to end things. But first we pass through this room with body-sized capsules, which reminds me of the very first room from Overblood? Anyone else picking up these vibes? Is it just me? Am I crazy? The Ark itself is a very traditional final area for a horror game, with weird flesh growing on all the walls and stuff, but it is also totally still another lab. They don't call it a lab, but for a game called Seven Mansions, there is one mansion and everything else is labs. Labs, 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 labs. We get our glimpse of the device constructed to destroy humanity, some kind of huge humanoid robot, when a pyramid just floats out of the wall and turns out to be a monitor by which the true villain is revealed. Alan. Triangle-shaped monitor man reveals that the robot is called Crystalia and is created out of Christie's DNA and is controlled by her will. This is sort of a lot to take in at once, but the basic objective from here becomes clear. Navigate to Christie, who is currently napping in a pod before she sleepwalks all of humanity to death. In order to do this, we must fight Giant Babyface on the wall. I love this era of games that just put absolutely crazy-ass enemy designs just because someone felt like there should be a mini-boss here and not for any cogent reason. This enemy inflicts damage by screaming, and it is completely unavoidable even with the pause trick because it hits immediately and has no animation startup to cancel, defeating the ultimate tactic. Fortunately, it's not actually very strong, so you can just shoot it to death and move on. Progressing upstairs, we get another broadcast from the Triangle Dimension, where Alan reveals that Christie is physically frail because she drank poop water many years ago and does not have a very long life ahead of her. And as a result, both of them came to hate humanity for their evil, polluting ways, so they're going to destroy the world. Raina fecklessly pleads with a whole #NotAllHumanity spiel, but it falls on deaf ears. And thus, the full shape of the plot is now laid bare. A sleep-powered Gundam is going to destroy the world as abstract revenge because a child drunk toilet water. I bet you didn't think this game would have an environmentalist message when you sat down to watch this video, because I sure didn't when I started playing it. Final stretch, navigate to Christie's pod. How this plays out depends on the chosen character. All characters have to fight this rock golem thing as their final boss, and I wish this was more interesting, but it's actually a very slow enemy that just has a lot of health, with the biggest obstacle being the AI, and their complete unwillingness to move out of the way instead of getting punched in the head. Again, hope you loaded them up with health kits to just commit to a damage race or get ready to be pausing again. Kay's solo game final puzzle set piece is having to prevent a bombing attack on the Ark by checking a computer, and then checking the other computer. The game gives you 6 full minutes to interact with the only 2 objects in this room. I know Kay is the action-focused character and all, but this is a serious low point even by that standard. Raina has to instead enter a code to call Ricky, who cancels out the bombing, but she also notably has the option to issue a counter-missile attack which causes an instant game over if you do it. The game warns you that this is a bad idea, but I gotta respect that they let you screw it up that way. The co-op game finale event, on the other hand, completely took the wind out of me because what is the least fitting thing you could think of to end a horror game with? A goddamn 2-player rhythm game, that's what. I say rhythm game, there's no actual music here, but it's definitely hitting notes as they cross a judgment line, so that's a rhythm game, leave me alone. The way this controls is that you steer the red portion of each character's red line to either the top, middle, or lower lane with the analog stick, and press A when the green blips cross the line. I was not expecting to have to call on my experience playing goddamn theater rhythm pair mode to get me through the finale of a horror game, but here we are. This was nevertheless extremely difficult for me to do because obviously the game assumes 2 independent players will be attempting it, and I think this would be a hard wall for anyone who doesn't have severe rhythm game brain rot like I do. But fortunately, I have trained my entire life for just such an occasion. It still took me like 20 tries to complete though. Mercifully, a failed attempt does not kill you and you can just retry, but still, god, this was a rough way to close the co-op game out. Completing whichever set piece you get given opens the way back to where you started, where the elevator can now be used, and that takes you to Christie sleeping in her capsule. Here you get a minute to mash talk on everyone in the scene, and then Christie to use her pendant, prompting the game's ending. Christie wakes up and decides actually she doesn't want to destroy humanity, proclaiming that life is great, actually. Good for her, very moving, but Alan decides that isn't good enough and tries to activate the Poop Water Gundam himself. Oh no! Oh my god, they had time to fit in a title drop. This game rules, dude. What? I did not edit that. I cannot stress enough that I did not edit that. That really is the cut the game goes with. Just smash cut back to the mansion. Christie's fine, she got better. Everything's fine. Except Alan received memory loss as a result of trying to activate the Gundam and reverted to the mental state of a child? What the hell? You can't predict this game, man. The two leave the island on a boat, clear blue sky overhead, as Raina proclaims, beautiful. God. Moving. Work of art. The two snog, and as a final parting shot, it is revealed that birds have cameras in their face. No idea what this is implying as a final shot, I think they just wanted to mess with you one last time. Roll credits, that's Ghastly Smile, baby. The ending you get is the same regardless of which character you pick or if you're playing in co-op, which seems like a bit of a missed opportunity to me. Except, there are hidden alternate endings we can delve into. I only know these exist because a friend of mine who owned the strategy guide offhand mentioned to me there was something in the book about them. But see, they said this to me like over a year ago, and do you ever just remember something someone said to you a really long time ago and you're scared to bring it up to them again because you'll think you'll look insane for trying to follow up on something after that long? God, I hope that's not just me. It's not just me, right? Well, anyway, I did what any sane and well-adjusted individual would do, and I just bought the strategy guide myself, because there was absolutely jack on either the English or Japanese internet about this game. As we can see, both characters have a secret love ending if you perform a couple of extra steps and see some extra scenes during the campaign, which mainly entails randomly backtracking to the McFerson residence a couple of times at arbitrary points during the game when the two leads are split up. There is, to the best of my knowledge, no in-game hints that point towards these endings even existing, much less what the steps are. Reyna's love ending has her getting together with Alan, and actually materially changes the outcome of the plot, with Reyna's puppy dog eyes able to convince Alan out of trying to activate Crystalia, and love prevails. Aww. Now, Kay's love ending has him getting together with Christy, and while it does not meaningfully impact the core story like Reyna's, what it is much funnier. In lieu of explanation, I will just leave you with my actual reaction the first time I achieved this ending on a livestream. Yeah, this is... Just unbelievable. The peppy pop music playing while Reyna runs off crying into the sunset. It's absolutely hysterical. I can't believe this is a real ending to a video game. More video games should end with their protagonist having a petty meltdown about not getting the guy, just for moments like this. And one last weird alternate ending I learned about from the strategy guide. The guide claims that if you take 18 hours from starting the game to reaching Ernest's jail cell, he will have died when you get there, ending the game early. I couldn't believe this because Ghastly Smile is like a 4-hour game, 5 hours tops, even on a regular playthrough. It's just not very long. There's no way this would happen on a normal playthrough. Nevertheless, I tested it out, and it's completely true. You get a non-standard game over with Ernest having just kicked the bucket while taking a nap for no obvious reason, and the game instructs you to get a move on next time. How bizarre is that? What kind of game does that? Ghastly Smile does that, and I love it for that. And with that, we have plumbed the depths of what Ghastly Smile has to offer us. Like I said, it's a pretty short game in contrast to this video's runtime, and there are sadly no bonuses to unlock by completing the game fast or under certain conditions like a Resident Evil would traditionally have. And the minimal differences in overall content between its scenarios means it's not got a lot of replay value. Not a good game by any definition, but still one I enjoyed, and I'm glad it was translated. Its terrible script is executed with complete earnestness, its janky and awful combat defies any expectation of how this kind of game ought to work, and its co-op, while ambitious and at times genuinely impressive, is remarkably awkward in practice and is prone to bugging out in weird ways. But I definitely still had a lot of fun with it. This kind of jank is a rare specimen of a game that was trying a lot of different design ideas at once, even if it expressed those ideas through the lens of a fairly blatant Resident Evil knockoff. Obviously, I do not recommend Ghastly Smile straight up, but if you've made it this far and have the same kind of love I do for the failed experiments of early 3D games, and survival horror games in particular, then Ghastly Smile may just be worth a look for you. But ultimately, it's no great loss this one wasn't officially translated back in its day, but it is great that we can now enjoy it in the fullness of time. Overall, I concur. Alright, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed this exploration of some jank Dreamcast survival horror, leave a like and subscribe, and consider supporting the channel via Patreon. I actually underwent a pretty big life change in the time it's taken to make this video. I now do content creation as a part-time job. I got my hours cut at my actual job to make more time for this, the videos, the streaming, and all that. Because I've been doing these things for so long, about a decade to be precise, and it's finally started to pan out for me. I no longer need to work a full-time job to make the ends meet. But I am now, nevertheless, as a result of that, more dependent on things like the Patreon than ever before. So if you liked this video, or have liked any of my videos, and have ever considered supporting the channel, now really would be a good time for that. And if you are already supporting on the Patreon, you have my heartfelt thanks, as without you guys, I really would not have even been able to attempt to make this work, even in a part-time capacity. I really do appreciate it. I enjoy these kinds of things. I like doing it, and I hope to bring you many, many more wonderful games in the future. Thank you again for watching. I hope to see you next time with a suitably interesting game in hand. See you then!